You know Henry VIII as the king with 6 wives who broke from Rome. But a 2009 study in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine argues that a chronic leg condition, one his own physicians unknowingly worsened, may explain his transformation from England's most admired prince into one of its most feared monarchs. And the evidence begins not with his tyranny, but with his athleticism. The story of Henry VIII's transformation begins not in the sick room, but in the tournament field. In his youth, Henry was the embodiment of Renaissance ideals, tall, athletic, and fiercely competitive. Venetian ambassador Sebastian Justinian, who observed the king at court in 1515, described him as the most splendid and vigorous of princes, a ruler whose physical presence commanded respect throughout Europe. Standing over 6 feet tall, Henry cut a striking figure in an age when most men were several inches shorter. His energy was legendary. He excelled at jousting, hunting, and tennis, and he relished public displays of strength. The Royal Armoury's 1514 inventory recorded a suit of tournament armor with a waist measurement of just 32 inches, evidence of a lean, powerful build in his early years. State records and eyewitness accounts from foreign envoys detail how Henry would ride for hours, then lead his courtiers in exhausting games of real tennis, or take on all comers in archery contests. At feasts, he was known to rise and dance for hours, his stamina the talk of Europe's diplomatic circles. Henry's charisma matched his physique. Justinian wrote home that the king was extremely handsome, with a commanding presence and a gift for conversation. His court became a magnet for musicians, scholars, and athletes, drawn by the king's passion for learning and his appetite for competition. Even minor illnesses seemed unable to slow him. In 1515, when Henry suffered a fever that alarmed his household, he recovered quickly and resumed his relentless schedule, determined not to show weakness before his subjects or foreign ambassadors. This was the Henry who inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure, a ruler whose physical prowess symbolized the health of the nation. The evidence from this period, preserved in state papers and ambassadorial letters, offers a vivid baseline, a young king whose body and spirit seemed unbreakable. It is against this backdrop of strength and vitality that the first signs of chronic illness would soon stand out in stark relief. For centuries, the story of Henry VIII has been dominated by his marriages and his break with Rome, but a close look at his health reveals a different kind of drama, one that began quietly in 1528. That year, the royal surgeon Thomas Vicari made a note in his medical manuscript of a troubling development. The king was suffering from what he called a sore legge, or sore leg. This was no simple injury from the tilt yard. Vicari's careful observation signaled the onset of a chronic condition that would shadow Henry for the rest of his life. The evidence from 1528 stands out because it is the first clear record of a persistent leg problem. State pharmacy records from that year show a steady supply of topical ointments, poultices, and bandages unusual for a monarch who until then had seemed almost immune to illness. Yet, there is no trace of mercury in these records, a detail that carries real weight. Mercury was the standard treatment for syphilis in Tudor England, prescribed in nearly every documented case. Its absence in Henry's apothecary accounts is striking, especially when combined with the lack of telltale symptoms among his queens. None of his wives showed the characteristic signs of advanced syphilis, such as skin lesions or neurological decline. Modern medical historians, including those referenced in the 2009 Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine study, have largely dismissed the syphilis theory on these grounds. Instead, contemporary and modern diagnoses have pointed elsewhere. Vicari's own description, preserved in his notes, refers to a recurring, inflamed ulcer that resisted healing. Later accounts mention swelling, heat, and frequent discharge, hallmarks of a chronic venous ulcer or perhaps osteomyelitis. a persistent infection of the bone. Some scholars have also suggested gout or diabetes as underlying factors, but the pattern of symptoms and the king's increasing immobility fit most closely with a stubborn, infected ulcer. Vickery's manuscript captures the moment when admiration for Henry's strength gave way to medical concern. The king's leg was no longer just a symbol of power on the tournament field. It had become a site of pain and vulnerability. This first medical alarm did not just foreshadow a personal struggle, it marked the beginning of a physical decline that would shape the politics and personality of Tudor England. The chronic condition that began in 1528 is not an excuse for what followed, but it is a vital piece of the puzzle, one that reframes how we understand the later years of Henry's reign. On January 24, 1536, the Greenwich tilt yard erupted with chaos. Henry VIII, then 44, entered the lists in full armor, determined to prove that age and injury could not touch him. The king's horse, spooked or misjudged, threw him violently to the ground. Chroniclers recorded that Henry was struck full force above the left knee and pinned beneath his armored mount. Eyewitnesses described how he lay unconscious for 2 hours, unresponsive to his frantic attendants. Court physician William Butts was summoned in haste, fearing the king would not survive the blow. The official tournament rolls noted extensive bruising and trauma to both legs. Soon after, the first signs of ulceration appeared at the site of the old wound on his left leg, a wound that, according to state papers, never fully healed. The accident's effects were immediate and severe. Henry's mobility declined sharply. Reports from Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuys described a monarch who could no longer mount a horse without assistance. The king's mood, once buoyant, turned volatile. Letters from courtiers and foreign envoys began to mention unpredictable rages and spells of withdrawal. The 1536 injury did not simply aggravate an old complaint. It transformed a manageable ailment into a chronic, debilitating condition. The king, who had once dominated the tournament ground, now found himself increasingly confined to his private chambers, his world shrinking as pain and infection took hold. The Greenwich catastrophe marked the point where Henry's physical decline became impossible to ignore, setting the stage for a new era of invasive care and medical intervention. The penalty for Henry VIII was not only the injury itself, but the medical wisdom of his age. Tudor physicians, bound by Galenic doctrine, believed that health depended on balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. When a wound refused to heal, it was seen as the body's attempt to expel harmful substances. As a result, daily lancing of Henry's leg became routine, ensuring the ulcer stayed open and continued to drain. Sloane Manuscript 1047, a royal medical compendium, details how physicians would probe the wound and apply plasters intended to draw out corrupted matter. The remedies themselves often worsened the condition. Pharmacy logs from the 1530s and the 1540s show repeated purchases of red lead, a known irritant which was mixed into ointments alongside honey, vinegar, and herbs. In 1540, the royal apothecary acquired a large batch of red lead specifically for the king's leg. Grey plaster, another staple of the royal medicine chest, combined lead, oil, and animal fat. These thick dressings were applied directly to the ulcer, sometimes trapping moisture and bacteria beneath. Such treatments, though well-intended, created a cycle of inflammation and infection that no amount of skill or expense could break. The king's physicians, working within the limits of Tudor science, inadvertently deepened the wound's hold on their patient. Each intervention, recorded in state papers and recipe books, reveals the structural cause behind Henry's unhealed ulcers, a medical system that mistook chronic infection for necessary purging, and in doing so, made recovery nearly impossible. By the final years of Henry VIII's reign, the king's private chambers had become a place few wished to linger. Imperial Ambassador Francois van der Delft wrote in 1546 of an odor so strong it clung to the king's clothes and filled the air around him. The source was no mystery. Chronic ulceration and persistent infection in Henry's left leg, aggravated by years of invasive treatments, had produced a wound that would not close. Sandalwood, imported at great expense and recorded in the royal accounts, was burned in braziers to mask the smell, but even this proved inadequate. The king's armor, once tailored for athletic contests, was now measured at 54 inches around the waist to accommodate swelling and weight gain. A mechanical hoist, detailed in the palace inventories, was installed to lift Henry onto his horse and eventually into bed. Those closest to the king, like Sir Anthony Denny, noted in private diaries the toll of unrelenting pain and the king's growing isolation. Yet the gravity of Henry's decline was shrouded in official silence. The 1534 Treason Act made it a capital crime to predict or even discuss the king's death. Physicians and courtiers alike tiptoed around the subject, careful not to betray concern. Only after Henry's passing did the full extent of his condition become clear. Modern medical analysis, including the 2009 Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine Review, points to multi-organ failure likely triggered by chronic infection and systemic inflammation, an end that was as much political as it was medical. The story of Henry's leg is not just one of personal agony, but of a monarch's final years shaped by illness, secrecy, and the limits of Tudor medicine. Henry VIII's chronic leg ulcers remind us that medical conditions can shape not just a life, but the course of history. Today, the intersection of health and leadership remains just as critical. We're left asking, how often does illness quietly influence power, policy, and the world we inherit?